Afternoon, everybody. It is day 42, Church in the Time of Quarantine. It is also April 27th, and on this day in 1822, Ulysses S. Grant was born. So happy birthday, General slash President Grant. And also on this day in 1509, Pope Julius II excommunicated the entire city of Venice. So if you ever wondered why the Reformation happened, well, that might offer you a little hint, but enough of that. Today we're again going to have an interview, and so that will be immediately after this with Father Andrew Grosso on faith and reason. It's really good. We'll do it in two parts again because it's fairly lengthy and don't want to exhaust your attention spans, but yeah, that will follow immediately after this. Quick announcements. Soup that we're gathering, that's Wednesday between 4 and 5:30. Bring that by the parish hall. I will do the blessing of the soups when they are all together, and we will send those off to those in need. So thanks to all who are participating in this. It's a really wonderful ministry. A reminder, we're planning to have a work day this Saturday. Right now, I don't think there's rain in the forecast. If it rains out, we'll do it the following Saturday. But also, you're more than welcome to be a freelance yard cleanup person. So I think the main things are leaves, raking leaves, probably some brush cutting, and just some general maintenance kind of stuff. So anything you see that looks out of place, you're welcome to clean it up within reason. Okay, but thanks to all of you who are going to be doing that. And that brings us to trivia. For trivia for yesterday, we had a winner, Glenn Jones, with which college football program in the modern era or the pole era has the most championships. And that's the University of Alabama, who have 12. So roll tide. That's also two more than the entire Pac-12 have, but just have to mention that. Okay, that brings us today. We're going to do a little history. And so in June 28th, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, starting the First World War. He was assassinated by Gavrilo Princip. And the question is, where was he assassinated? So when Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, where was it? If you know this, please send it in. Okay, well, without further ado, let's move to interview with Father Andrew Grosso, and hope you enjoy it. Thanks. Talk to you soon. All right. Well, good afternoon or morning or whenever you're watching this episode. Today we fresh off the heels of Father Pay, we have Father Andrew Grosso, who a good friend of mine. We work together at Nashotah House, and he is now at the cathedral in South Carolina. I will let him introduce you with all his credentials, but basically today we're going to be talking about faith and reason and all that. So it should be a great conversation. And Andrew, if you want to kind of tell everyone where you're coming from, and then we'll go through some questions.
Thank you. Yes, as Father Cunningham indicated, my name is Father Andrew Grosso. I'm currently serving as the canon to the dean at Trinity Cathedral in Columbia, South Carolina. I've been here for not quite 3 years now. I'm actually serving as acting dean because the cathedral's in the search for a new dean. So the cathedral's in a bit of a transitional time. So I'm kind of keeping a lot of plates spinning right now. Prior to coming to Columbia, as Father Cunningham said, I was at Nashotah House, where Philip and I worked together for about 3 years, I think. And my background, both while I was at Nashotah House and prior to that, has always involved kind of bouncing back and forth between the church and the academy. I've found myself called to a ministry as a priest in the church, and I've found myself called to a different kind of ministry involving scholarship, theological scholarship and philosophical scholarship. So the relationship between those two worlds and the relationship between the different expectations and standards that people have with regards to how we think about the faith in those two worlds is something that's always intrigued me. So the question of the relationship between faith and reason is one that I come at from a couple of different perspectives. I come at it from the perspective of a parish priest who tries to help Christians think reasonably about their faith, but I also come at it from the perspective of someone who's done a little bit of scholarly work and a little bit of teaching and wants to think very rigorously and critically and comprehensively about the faith as well. So,
Well, great. Well, thank you for being with us. This is fun, and I don't know who
yeah,
knows. We're trying to figure out what to call these. I don't know if the St. John Chrysostom sessions or something like that. But anyway, we'll see if it becomes famous. You can say I was there way back.
I was there when. That's right. Yeah.
I wouldn't count on that. But anyway, okay. Well, to start the conversation, we talk about faith and reason. At least secularly, you kind of have this idea that reason is this kind of, it's the defender of truth, justice, and all that is wonderful. And faith is kind of, at best, it's something that makes you feel good. And kind of at worst, it gives you the Salem witch trials and David Koresh and movies with Kirk Cameron and stuff like that. So could you kind of explain when we throw these terms out there, what some good definitions of what we mean when we throw faith and reason out there?
Well, I think you're right to start here, because I think there is a broad expectation in the culture right now, and has been for many, many years, that in some respects, faith and reason are different versions of the same thing. And that faith is what we do when we think uncritically, and reason is what we do when we think critically. And that therefore what faith enables us to do is to think about things that we don't really understand, but once we understand something, then faith is no longer necessary, because now we know about it. We understand it, we're able to critically analyze it, we're able to explore it and prove it and justify it. And that expectation, we find that expectation in a whole realm of kind of dichotomies that we routinely hear about in public discourse. We hear about the difference between objectivity and subjectivity. And we think that reason is objective and faith is subjective. Or we hear about the public and the private, and we think that reason is that which is operative in the public sphere, and therefore faith should be operative primarily in the private sphere. Or we hear about facts and values, and we think that facts primarily have to do with reason and things that we know and things that we can prove and demonstrate. And values are a bit more slippery, and we can't really prove them, and they're more a matter of personal preference, if you will. That whole, or maybe just to kind of put a fine point on this, we think in terms of the head and the heart, and we think of reason as being primarily something that we do with our head, with our mind, with our brain specifically, and values and subjective beliefs and faith are something that pertain more to something that we do with our heart. So we've got this whole litany of dichotomies that we use to try and organize our experience. And those dichotomies at this point are pretty hardwired into our cultural framework. They pretty much come, they come with the package of the cultural assumptions that we have about the way the world works, and what human nature is like, and how we understand things about God, and how we understand things about morality, and how we understand truth, goodness, beauty, Kirk Cameron films, all the rest of it. But more recently, what I think some people have begun to discover is that the dichotomies don't really work. They don't really hold up. It becomes really difficult to try and sustain a strict separation between the objective and the subjective, or between the public and the private, or between the head and the heart. The further you try and push those things apart, the more untenable it becomes. Now, what that doesn't mean is that we can simply collapse them into one another and say, okay, well, there's no difference whatsoever, and whatever you happen to believe is true for you, and whatever I happen to believe is true for me. I mean, that's kind of the other end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum, if we're not going to force them apart, then well, let's just put them together, and let's acknowledge that everybody has their own truth, and everybody has their own values, and everybody has their own view of reality. The Supreme Court actually tried to put that into law, use that language in a legal precedent. I won't get into that, the recent unpleasantness, but but that's a problem too. I mean, we found that we can't push them apart, and we found that we can't just collapse them into one another. So we're really at a stage historically and culturally in which we're trying to think through another way of understanding these things. And I think the church has a lot to offer in this regard, because our understanding of the relationship between faith and reason is one that I think is consistent with an acknowledgement that we do use both our head and our heart when we think about things, and that facts and values both come into play when we think about God and the world and ourselves. And that while there is definitely a distinction between the public and the private, There's no strict separation between them. So as I think about faith and reason myself, I tend to see reason as a species of faith. In other words, faith is the broader, more comprehensive category, and reason is then a specific instance of faith applied in a particular way. Faith, I think, the broadest possible definition we might give of faith would be purposeful action. Any action we undertake that is intended to produce a particular result or achieve a particular goal or enable us to move in a particular direction. That, to a certain extent, that's the best definition of faith that I can think of. It's the sense that we have in our environment that there is some possibility out there ahead of us or beyond us or whatever. And if we just do this, whatever this is, that's an exercise of faith. We don't know for sure that we're going to be able to successfully perform that action, but in light of the perceived purpose or in light of the perceived meaning that we expect would attend that activity, we undertake that activity. I want to sit down on a chair. I'm in a room and I'm tired and I want to sit down because I'm feeling tired. So I see a chair and I think to myself, it would sure be nice to sit down and rest for a minute. Now, at that moment, I don't know that that chair will support me. Maybe the chair is broken. Maybe there's a problem with the chair. Maybe it's not a chair. Maybe it's a hologram that's been produced by a computer. Maybe I'm hallucinating. There are lots of things I don't know with certainty about the chair. But I do know that if I move in the direction of the chair and I comport myself in a particular way, I'll find out, right? So in faith, I undertake an action that is intended to result in some kind of meaning, purposeful outcome. And lo and behold, I find myself sitting in a chair and I think, that feels good. And now reasonably, I can think about what just happened and I can analyze that experience and go down to the whatever the most fundamental level of that experience is and think about how I went about that, and what happened, and what has happened to validate my experience of being able to sit down in the chair. I mean, the example is a somewhat absurd one, but I hope it illustrates what I mean when I say that I understand reason to be a species of faith, and that I understand faith to be purposeful action that is intended to result in a meaningful outcome. Reason is what happens when we find ourselves having successfully performed some kind of purposeful action, and we step back and we say, what just happened? What did I just do? I started here, I went to there, I wanted to achieve this, I wanted to accomplish this. Now, what exactly does that mean? What exactly does that intend about, what have I learned about myself? What have I learned about the world? What have I learned about truth, goodness, and beauty? What have I learned about God? What does this experience of purposeful action reveal to me that I might then use to conduct additional purposeful actions?
So I guess in that kind of how you're defining it, that reason has something to say to faith, but does then faith not necessarily have anything to say to reason?
Oh yeah, very much so. I think they have kind of a reciprocating relationship. Faith is the context and the framework that allows reason to operate. Because if you try to find a good reason to do anything, if you kind of divorce yourself from purposeful action and you say, well, I'm just going to sit here until I figure out with certainty what I should do, and then I'm going to go ahead and do it, you'll find yourself sitting there a very, very, very long time. Right? And in fact, you might never get up, right? So faith is that framework within which reason can operate. But then faith only gets you so far, as it were. I mean, once you've undertaken a purposeful action, then you find it necessary to reflect on what you've just done and the nature of the new understanding you have of reality. Reason has to come into play and kind of backstop, if you will, or backfill your understanding of the action that you've just undertaken. So you move forward. It's kind of like 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. As long as you keep doing that, you're making progress. Now, you might not get there as quickly as you'd like. Maybe you want to get there 3 steps, 3 steps, 3 steps. But if you're attentive to the application of reason as you move, you will always be moving forward, and you'll always be doing so in a way that you can reasonably be assured is getting you closer and closer to a better understanding of reality. It's when we allow our faith to, carry us away without applying critical reason that we can suddenly find ourselves in some very weird places because we've just taken 3 steps, 3 steps, 3 steps, and haven't done the careful work of going back and clarifying what it is we've done. Or it's when we try and, guarantee with certainty that this particular action is going to result in that particular outcome. We're not going to take a step until we can do that. Then we don't go anywhere. So I think faith and reason kind of reciprocate and feed on one another. They help one another along. Faith enables reason to get going in the first place, and then reason comes along and allows faith to clarify itself and to set its sights again for further purposeful action.
Okay. So something, and this wasn't in one of the questions I wrote ahead of time, so I'm giving you a pop quiz here. But no, it reminded what you're talking about. I remember reading a story. I can't remember the author, but he spent some time in Africa. I can't remember which country, and he said, you drive along a road there, and the roads are narrow and windy, and said you come flying around a corner, and there's a bus, and you both you squeeze through, and you almost go off the cliff, but said that country's mindset would be, well, that worked fine. We'll do that again. Whereas the Western mindset would be never, ever do that again. So what is that? Are they both using reason?
That's an interesting question, because the question, in some respects, that question is a version of the question whether or not we can say there is a form of reason that transcends culture. Give you the exact same example in slightly different language. Say in one culture, this is immediately germane to our current situation. We've got a disease, right? There's a pandemic. There's something going on in the world that is affecting people's health, and it's crossing cultural boundaries. Here we are. In one society, we know that the application of certain chemicals in certain conditions will result more often than not in certain outcomes with regards to health and well-being. So we do that. In other societies, they may have different expectations, and they may apply different methods, different materials, different rituals, in the same hope that what they're doing is improving well-being. Well, sometimes some of them work and sometimes some of them don't. The question then becomes, is it right for, if this culture uses chemicals injected into people in hospitals to cure disease, and this particular culture uses animal sacrifice in order to cure disease, is there a difference? Well, we'd like to think that there is, but the problem is that the framework within which both of those approaches to disease operate involves much more than just the way that they approach disease. In other words, the way you think about disease has everything to do with how you think about the world, how you think about human beings, how you think about the relationship between humanity and the natural order, God, the divine, whatever we want to call that. Same thing is true over here. How we think about disease has everything to do with how we think about human nature and the world and the divine and all the rest of it. So when we begin to ask the kind of question, are both cultures doing it reasonably? There is a sense in which they both are, but the thing is that they have a different understanding of what counts as reason. So then the question becomes, is there some field, or is there some question that we can ask that clarifies an understanding of reason that transcends those cultural differences? And from a Christian perspective, I think the answer to that is God. The question of the nature and the identity and the existence of God, historically in the Western tradition, has been the question that we use to adjudicate perceived differences about how we think about reason and the application of reason. Because ultimately, when you start asking questions about human nature or the world or disease or suffering in the world, evil, whatever it is you're going to talk about, the nature of beauty, eventually you're going to find yourself asking questions about the transcendent, the divine, God, however, whatever language we use for that. So historically, the Western tradition has used the question of God as a way of adjudicating, ultimately, questions about the nature of transcultural reason. But once you take God out of the picture, that becomes a much more difficult question to try and arbitrate, because then you've got to put something else in its place. And modern kind of secular and society has tried to put something other than God in the place of transcendent reason, and has used, values or human rights or whatever, affection, love, justice, beauty, do no harm, choose your bumper sticker of choice, whatever. That's all well and good, but all you've basically done is substituted something for God. And ultimately, whatever it is you've substituted for God is itself going to depend upon a higher conversation. So the ultimate answer, I think, to your question has to do with how we think about God and the relationship between God and reason, and whether or not we can say that God has something to do with human reason, and whether or not humans can reasonably be said to know something about God. And Christians, of course, would say absolutely. God is the source of all truth. God is the source of all goodness. God is the source of all beauty. And there's various ways that it's possible for us to know God.
Right. Well, switching gears here for a little bit, kind of move into the more practical sort of application of faith and reason. So when I was in Germany, I took a class, I don't remember what it was called, but anyway, the professor basically made the argument, if I remember right, and I remember my German correctly, but we'll say I do, that Christianity was sort of this synthesis between Athens and Jerusalem. So the toga wearing guys in Athens, walked around and thought stuff, and then the prophets in Israel had visions of God, and Christianity kind of sticks those two things together, and all the two great sources of thought in the history of the world come together, and everyone's happy. Have you heard that argument?
Oh yeah.
And what do you think of it? If you
Well, yes, the argument has been around for some time, and there's a whole myriad of questions here. First of all, we would really have to, I think, do a bit more work unpacking what we mean both by Greek thought and what we mean by Jewish thought, by Hebrew thought, because it's not the case that and I mean, this. I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. But it's not the case that there is this kind of monolithic body of truth out there called Greek thought that all the Greeks agreed on. I mean, you've got the Platonic tradition, you've got the Aristotelian tradition, you've got Stoicism, you've got Epicureanism, you've got there was a whole school, there was a range of thought represented within the Greek tradition. And the Latin tradition picked up some of that and added some of its own elements, and it's all kind of this very big, confusing mix. The same thing, to a certain extent, I think, can also be said of the Hebrew tradition. You mentioned the prophetic tradition. That's certainly part and parcel of Judaism of the time, classical Judaism. But there was also a whole bunch of other stuff going on there. There was the apocalyptic tradition. There was an ascetical tradition. There was a priestly tradition. There was a liturgical tradition that was part and parcel of Jewish thought up until the destruction of the temple in around the year 70. So Judaism, neither Jewish thought nor Greek thought are monolithic or are monochromatic. So we need to, if we really wanted to kind of, bang that drum, we need to nail down specifically what we mean when we talk both about Greek thought and about Jewish thought. Okay, with that in mind, yes, I think it's true to say that Christianity drew on both Greek thought and Jewish thought. But the interesting thing that Christianity did is that it ended up reconfiguring both of them. What Christianity had to do was to say, we believe that in Jesus Christ and our experience of the Holy Spirit, God has fulfilled the covenant with Israel, and the scriptures are true. And at the same time, we need to find some way of articulating this to the pagans around us who don't know anything about Abraham and Moses and David and God's covenant with Israel. What is the language that they're using? Is there some way that we can reach out to them? Kind of the classic example of this is Paul at the Areopagus speaking to the Athenians and saying, Athenians, I see you are a very religious people. You even got an altar to a god you don't even know who it is, and you're worshiping that god. Congratulations, let me help with that. Right? I mean, that's Paul kind of latching on to what's available and making use of the resources that are given to him in the broader non-Jewish culture and trying to make sense of the gospel in that way. So yes, Christianity does draw on, without question, Jewish thought and the faith and practice of Israel. And yes, without question, Christianity drew on the broader intellectual and moral and aesthetic framework that was provided by Greco-Roman culture. But it ended up changing both of those traditions in some significant ways. Christianity retained language about the temple. It retained language about sacrifice. It retained language about salvation. It retained language about God. It retained language about Abraham, and all of those things, drew all that from Israel. But it reconfigured them around the person of Jesus, and said, and Christians said, in light of Jesus, we now think about salvation like this, and we now think about God like this, and we now think about the temple like this, and we now think about Israel like this. And they did the exact same thing with Greek thought. Okay, so the Greeks have the language of phusis and ousia and hypostasis and persona and prosopon and blah, blah, blah. I'm just using categories that were used to articulate the church's understanding of the doctrine of the incarnation in Trinitarian theology. But when the church adopted those, they changed them. They reconfigured them in a way that was, again, centered on the revelation of God in Jesus Christ, and said, in light of what we now know God has done in Jesus, we now understand hypostasis to mean this. We now understand ousia to mean this. We now understand Greco-Roman moral traditions to look like this. This is how you do that. So yes, it drew on them, but it significantly reconfigured both of them.
Would it be too flippant to say they did to Greek philosophy what they did with the Christmas tree?
Well, there's something to that, though. One of the arguments that sometimes people will make about why Christianity isn't true is that, well, Christianity just it drew on this, or it stole the Yule log, or it stole this festival, or it stole But there's a sense in which that's exactly what the gospel is supposed to do. The gospel is supposed to go out into the world and to say, Athenians, I see you are a very religious people. Or Northern Germanic peoples, I see you've got this tradition of a Yule log, or whatever it is. Let us help you with that. This is what that really signifies. Let us take that into the framework of the gospel, and you will see what that really means. Because that thing that you thought meant something about God and the world and yourselves, and good, the true, the good, and the beautiful, it does, but you won't really see it for what it is until you put it within the light of the gospel. So you baptize it, right? You take it within the framework of Christian truth, and all of a sudden, its meaning becomes open in new ways, and it leads you in some new directions. It's less so the job of the church. It would make less sense for the church to draw those things into itself and to Christianize them than it makes more sense for the church to do that than it does for the church to just push everything away and say, nope, there's none of God in that. There's nothing related to the gospel there. That's of no use to us. If the church took that approach, then they basically have to invent everything from whole cloth. But part of what we confess in the gospel is that God is the God of the whole world, and God is the God of all peoples. And part of what we believe is that God's Spirit is active amongst all peoples. This is Paul in Romans, right? God has not left himself without a witness. God never leaves himself without a witness. Part of the job of the church is to go to those cultures and to say, this is what your experience of truth, goodness, and beauty has been pointing you to all along. Mm-hmm. So I'm good with Yule logs.
Yeah.
I'm good with Christmas trees.
Well, I remember hearing someone, I think they were Sioux or something, and from the Sioux tribe, and saying, when missionaries came, they went, oh yeah, this is what we've been, and that's what you call it. Okay, great. It's, that sort of thing. So
absolutely. Yeah.
Well, good.